Racist neighbor calls cops on black family. What happens next is unbelievable. A shrill scream cut through the late afternoon air, sending birds scattering in a flurry of wings and startled cries. The usually quiet street erupted in sudden chaos as a police cruiser skidded to a halt right in front of the house with the pale green shutters, its tires screeching and leaving faint skid marks on the asphalt. Onlookers, some peeking from behind half-drawn curtains, others surreptitiously standing on their porches, watched with rapt attention as two officers vaulted out of the car. The swirling red and blue lights illuminated a scene that was unsettling for its everyday normalcy turned ominous. A black mother, Ebony White, clutched her toddler's hand, while the child's face twisted with confusion and fear. Nearby, Ebony's husband stood frozen on the lawn, the half-raked leaves in the crisp fall wind offering a stark contrast between the mundane act of yard work and the absolute dread now clouding his expression. The officer in front, tall with an unyielding gaze, moved forward, one hand hovering near his holster, raised both his hands slowly. Ebony's grip tightened around her daughter's fingers. Their expressions were laced with that brand of terror that sometimes wells up unbidden from deep within, a reflex born from stories and experiences passed down through generations. All around them, the neighborhood stood in silent witness, uncertain how to react, as if reality had momentarily shifted and no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. Inside the house across the street, a curtain fell back into place, and an elderly woman's sharp eyes watched the developments with grim satisfaction. She had called 911 just moments ago, breathless and insistent that her new neighbors posed some kind of threat. Her name was Mrs. Nelson, and she'd lived on Sylvan Street for nearly 30 years, long enough that most people vaguely considered her a fixture of the neighborhood. She was known for her obsessive care of her lawn, her pointed remarks about property values, and her brazen willingness to label anyone who didn't fit her idea of the community's standards. She glared through the window, certain she had done the right thing by summoning the police to handle this problem before it could escalate. In truth, what she actually saw was a loving family who had moved in earlier that summer, determined to create a home. But in her eyes, they were intruders who did not belong. Glanced anxiously at his wife, forcing himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that he had done nothing wrong. All he'd been doing was raking leaves, while Ebony carried grocery bags from the car, their daughter squealing happily each time she jumped on a crunchy patch of leaf pile. Life had seemed almost serene for those few minutes, then chaos arrived in the form of spinning lights and screeching tires. The first officer approached with cautious steps, the second circling around to his side. Felt his heart hammering against his chest, but he stilled his hands, trying to show that he posed no threat. "I'm not armed," said quietly, his voice steady even though every nerve in his body was alight with anxiety. "Is there a problem, officers?" The second officer's gaze darted between and Ebony, then toward the child. He looked tense, uncertain. The first officer, though, was more hardened, more assertive. His voice was gruff. "We got a call about suspicious activity." Ebony inhaled sharply. "We live here," she said, her tone both incredulous and fearful. She motioned toward the house. "We moved in a few months ago. This is our home." The first officer studied their anxious faces, the toddler's wide eyes, the half-finished yard work behind them. The second officer seemed to realize that something felt off about the whole scenario. There was no sign of a threat, no immediate reason for alarm, and yet they had come in with sirens, lights, and suspicion. The sense of tension hung heavy, a confounding weight that seemed impervious to logic or normal courtesy. Swallowed a lump in his throat. He feared how the next few seconds would unfold. He'd read enough headlines to know how quickly misunderstandings could turn tragic. He forced himself to maintain eye contact, to speak slowly, carefully. "Officers, my name is White. This is my wife, Ebony, and our daughter. We have lived here since August. I have no idea why you were called." From across the street, Mrs. Nelson observed with that frigid righteousness that had become a part of her mannerisms. In her mind, she had legitimate grounds for the call. They were loud, always having people over, always playing some new music. Never mind that it was typically just Ebony's mother visiting or Ebony's occasional attempts to teach fun nursery rhymes. It was loud to Mrs. Nelson, and it was suspicious because she did not recognize or trust them. Now, she watched the officers as if she were a sovereign overseer, ensuring that they confronted this new family in a way that would either force them to conform or drive them out. To his relief, the second officer took a step back, subtly signaling that the situation did not warrant the dramatic display of aggression they had shown up with. We received a call about trespassing, possible burglary. He paused. Does anyone else live here? Ebony blinked. No, just us. Felt the tension shift. He couldn't tell if the officer believed them or if he was merely diffusing the confrontation. For a moment, it seemed as though reason might prevail. The first officer took out a small notepad, scrawling something. Can I see some identification? He asked, not unkindly, but with the routine authority that made Ebony hesitate. She needed to put down her daughter's hand to fish out her wallet from her purse, and every small motion felt impossibly, like any sudden move would trigger an irreversible reaction. Of course, Ebony said, voice trembling, searching through her bag. She handed him her driver's license. Did the same, careful to make no rapid gestures. The second officer examined them, nodded, then handed them back. We'll verify this address, the first officer said, though his tone had softened now that he saw Ebony's ID carried the same address as the house in front of them. We just got a phone call. We have to follow up. His partner keyed a few details into the patrol car's computer. Who called you? Ebony demanded, frustration slipping into her voice. She felt violated. After all, she'd done absolutely nothing. We're out here living our lives, and someone calls you on us. The second officer hesitated, looking at his partner for a cue. We can't disclose that, ma'am, he said carefully. If everything checks out, we'll be on our way. Sorry for the inconvenience. In the hush that followed, Ebony and exchanged weary glances. It felt more than an inconvenience. It felt humiliating, threatening. The toddler started to whimper, confused by her parents' distress and the presence of the uniformed strangers. Lifted the child, hugging her gently, trying to ward off her tears. The swirl of lights on top of the police cruiser splashed red and blue patterns across the pavement, across their faces, flickering like an accusation that refused to dissipate. Finally, after what felt like an interminable wait, the second officer returned from the patrol car. Everything seems fine, he said, his voice quieter now. We'll let dispatch know it's clear. The first officer gave a curt nod, then addressed an Ebony. I apologize for the confusion, he said in a tone that suggested he wasn't entirely remorseful, but was constrained by protocol. We had to respond to the complaint. Ebony's hands were still shaking. She opened her mouth to retort, to demand some kind of explanation, but she caught sight of his tremulous face. She swallowed her words, not wanting to escalate matters. Instead, she forced herself to say, thanks for clearing it up, the politeness tasting bitter on her tongue. The officers retreated to their cruiser, the siren lights flicking off. Neighbors who had been drawn out by the commotion quickly slunk back into their houses or pretended to carry on with other tasks, as if they hadn't been gawking this entire time. Released a long breath. For a moment he locked eyes with his wife, and in that shared gaze was an unspoken question. Was this just the beginning? From her window, Mrs. Nelson watched the police car drive off. A prickle of annoyance bloomed in her chest. She felt they hadn't done enough. She wondered if maybe she should have given them more reason, embellished the story further. If anyone had asked her, she would have simply declared she was looking out for the safety of the neighborhood. No regrets. She'd make sure, one way or another, that the values and the feel of Sylvan Street remained exactly as she believed it should be. She half expected Ebony or to come storming over and confront her for making that call, but no such thing happened. Mrs. Nelson allowed herself a smug grin, convinced that she had already claimed a small victory. Days passed. The crisp fall weather descended more assuredly, painting the neighborhood in reds, oranges, and yellows. Worked his 9 to 5 at a local marketing firm, Ebony taught dance classes at a nearby studio in the evenings, and continued her boisterous explorations of their yard, squealing delight at every new leaf pile. Tension from the incident lingered, a quiet bruise on the spirit of the household, but they tried to move forward. They tried to tell themselves it was an isolated misunderstanding. Then came the looks, the hushed murmurs. Even from neighbors who had initially been friendly, there was now a slight shift in their posture, as though they were caught between two narratives. Some folks empathized with the whites, seeing that they were obviously decent people just living their lives. Others found Mrs. Nelson's rumor mill more persuasive. She had begun whispering that the family was attracting the wrong element, making vague references to strange visitors who dropped by at odd times. In reality, Ebony's sister worked night shifts and often stopped by around midnight for dinner or just to chat, but Mrs. Nelson spun it as an ominous sign. Each new wave of gossip caused subtle friction in the neighborhood. Children picking up on whispered conversations, sometimes repeated slurs at on the playground, or mimicked expressions of scorn gleaned from their parents. Subtle lines were drawn, alliances quietly formed. The Whites felt this creeping hostility every time they stepped outside. Ebony would catch a neighbor's eye, only for them to look away, as if acknowledging her presence might be taken as an act of treason against the neighborhood's reigning matriarch, Mrs. Nelson, one late afternoon, decided to be proactive. He walked over to the neighbor on the right, a middle-aged man named who had once waved at him good-naturedly, extended a hand. "Hey, I just wanted to say hi. We haven't really had a chance to talk." Looked taken aback, as though he'd been approached by someone dangerously unfamiliar. After a moment's pause, he smiled awkwardly, shaking his hand. "Hey, right, sorry about, the other day with the cops." His expression was pinched, as if torn between sympathy and worry about being watched. Forced a reassuring grin. "Yeah, that was unexpected. I just want to make sure we're good neighbors, you know? Let's look out for each other. We're planning to host a small barbecue soon, just to meet people." Oleg nodded, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Sure, that sounds nice," he said, though his tone was non-committal. Walked back to his house, a knot of disappointment forming in his chest. He'd tried, but's reaction told him that the seeds of suspicion had already taken root. A simple barbecue invitation had triggered some internal alarm that couldn't quite put a finger on. He recalled Ebony's face on that day, how her hands trembled when handing over her ID, and it filled him with a renewed determination. The only way to disprove the rumors was to continue to show who they were. A loving, hardworking family who just wanted a peaceful life. However, on a morning not long after, Ebony woke to find their mailbox knocked over, the post cracked clean through. She discovered it when she went out to pick up a package that was supposed to be delivered. The mailbox lay face down on the grass, the metal box dented. At first, she thought it could have been a careless driver, but the noticeable angle of impact suggested something more deliberate, a direct, forceful kick or push. She reported it too, and the two of them spent hours ruminating over who might have done it. Naturally, their suspicion landed on Mrs. Nelson, or perhaps someone she'd enlisted to do her dirty work. Yet without evidence, there was nothing they could do but replace the mailbox and hope it was an isolated incident. But the hits kept coming, albeit in small, demoralizing ways. A window egged on a Friday night, a strange note left on their welcome mat reading, "Go back to where you belong," and the occasional group of kids, obviously egged on by hateful adults, biking past and chanting slurs with a mix of childish glee and maliciousness. And Ebony found themselves on an emotional roller coaster: fear, anger, sadness, resolve, exhaustion. They tried lodging a formal complaint with the local police, but the incidents were minor, the proof scant. The officers who arrived for the egging incident scrawled some notes, shrugged sympathetically, and said there wasn't much they could do. No cameras, no witnesses, no suspects. It was just petty vandalism, they reasoned. In quieter moments, Ebony found herself trembling with rage and heartbreak. She'd hoped that by moving to Sylvan Street, they'd finally have a stable environment, a fresh start for their young daughter. Instead, she felt as though they were trapped in a slow-burning war that no one else seemed interested in acknowledging. Sensitive to her parents' moods, would ask, "Mommy, why are you sad?" Ebony would try to mask it, offering a bright smile and telling her everything was okay, determined not to let her child's innocence be marred by these vile acts. All the while, from her perch behind pristine curtains, Mrs. Nelson thrived on the tension. She saw each little incident as proof that the neighborhood was rejecting this family. Sometimes, she'd bring up the Whites in conversation with other neighbors, stoking fear with insinuations. "There's been more trouble on this street since they arrived," she'd say, or, "I'm telling you, it's not a coincidence that we've had these disturbances." She painted herself as a concerned citizen, twisting the script so she appeared the victim of a changing, unpredictable environment. One day, Ebony returned from her dance studio exhausted, only to find leaning against the kitchen counter with a torn expression. He stared at his phone. Ebony's heart seized. She set her bag down. "What's wrong?" she asked. He exhaled slowly, passing his phone to her. There was a social media feed open, featuring a group page titled Sylvan Street Neighbors. Someone had posted a photo of an Ebony, taken from what looked like a distance. The angle suggested it was shot from behind Mrs. Nelson's curtains or possibly from a car window. The caption read, "New residents causing a stir, warn your kids to stay away." Several comments beneath it ranged from subtle insinuations to outright racial slurs, though some neighbors chimed in to refute the hateful rhetoric. It was a messy, heart-wrenching thread. Ebony felt fury boiling inside her chest. "They've crossed a line," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't stay silent anymore. This is harassment." Was busy coloring in the living room, and Ebony lowered her tone so as not to startle her. "We can't let them bully us." His jaw tightened. "I know," he said. He stared at the post again, reading the vile comments. "We keep trying to be the bigger person, but maybe it's time we took some real action. Let's talk to a lawyer, Ebony. Let's see what our rights are." She nodded, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, tears born of frustration, anger, and a longing for simple peace. They arranged a consultation with a local civil rights attorney. He explained that while many of the incidents they described were indeed hateful and possibly racially motivated, proving them in court could be challenging unless they had direct evidence of who was behind it. Furthermore, there was the question of whether the police were intentionally ignoring a racially biased crime or just overwhelmed by other priorities. The attorney suggested that filing a formal complaint with the city might be an avenue, especially if they could gather enough eyewitness accounts of intimidation or harassment. He also advised them to set up security cameras around their property to document any further incidents. After the meeting, Ebony did just that, installing a camera in the driveway, another near the front porch, and a third covering the backyard. It gave them a glimmer of hope that if anything happened again, they could at least have proof. Simultaneously, they reached out more to neighbors who seemed sympathetic, hoping to cultivate alliances that might erode the hateful atmosphere. In these difficult weeks, Ebony found solace in her work at the dance studio. There, she was simply Miss Ebony, the lively, encouraging instructor who taught children and teenagers to express themselves through movement. Her students adored her, and she felt their respect and affection provided a balm for the daily hostility at home. Sometimes, the mothers of her students, particularly those who had endured prejudice themselves, would offer words of support, telling Ebony she was brave, that things would get better. She held on to that faith, for the workplace was equally a refuge and a minefield. He worked among a diverse set of colleagues who seemed welcoming, yet the tension in his life sapped his energy, and he occasionally found himself distracted, brooding over the next possible hostile act. One afternoon, a colleague named noticed his stressed demeanor. "Kenny, you okay, man? You've been quiet lately." Hesitated, unsure whether to unburden himself at work, but was a friend, always fair-minded. "Honestly, I'm having trouble at home. My new neighbor is, well, she's been making life hell, harassing my family. It's all because we're black." His eyes flared with anger. "That's terrible. Maybe we can help. My cousin is a journalist. She might be interested in exposing what's happening in our quiet little suburb." Felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps publicity would galvanize the authorities or shame the perpetrators into stopping. Yet he worried about the spotlight it would shine on his family, especially on Ebony, and, still, the notion that someone might tell their story more widely felt empowering. He told he'd consider it, wanting first to discuss it with Ebony. Meanwhile, Mrs. Nelson was not content to simply lurk and watch her hateful seeds grow. One chilly morning, noticed a suspicious figure lurking by their fence. It was a man in his late 20s or early 30s, wearing a hooded jacket. Stepped out onto the porch, locking eyes with the man, who hesitated and then walked off in a hurry. Later, Ebony found Mrs. Nelson talking to this same man on her porch, whispering conspiratorially. That evening, the Whites discovered more graffiti, hidden behind their trash bins, vile words scrawled in red paint. It became clear that Mrs. Nelson was escalating, possibly enlisting others to do her dirty work. The nerve it took to vandalize their property in broad daylight both rattled and enraged. He retrieved the security camera footage, discovering a blurry figure wearing a hood. The image wasn't clear enough to identify him as the man from that morning, but it was something. They provided this to the police, who seemed more attentive this time. The fact that repeated incidents were happening might at least encourage them to keep an eye on the area. One brisk Saturday, Ebony decided she wouldn't let fear keep her locked inside. She set up a lemonade table outside, a bold and simple act, determined to reclaim normalcy. helped stirring the lemonade, handing out cups to anyone passing by. A few neighbors stopped to chat, though some glared or mumbled excuses to rush away. Ebony tried to maintain a bright, unshaken smile. Then she saw Mrs. Nelson step onto her porch, arms folded. She was about to say something snide. Ebony could tell. The old woman's lips were pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. But before she could, a car pulled up, and Ebony's mother stepped out, bringing a grocery bag filled with pastries. She greeted Ebony warmly, ignoring Mrs. Nelson's presence across the street. For a moment, Ebony felt triumphant. This was her life, her family, and she would not allow bigotry to define it. But the sense of victory was fleeting. The next day, the Whites were out in their driveway when a squad car rolled by slowly, the same officers from before glancing at them. It was a tense moment of silent understanding. The family was under scrutiny, for no reason other than their presence and the incessant calls by a venomous neighbor. All Ebony could do was nod politely, even as anger simmered below the surface. His frustration reached a boiling point one evening after he got home from work. He paced the living room, ranting to Ebony about the unfairness of it all. "I can't keep living like this, Ebony. Our daughter shouldn't have to witness this hate day after day. She's going to grow up thinking the world is nothing but suspicion and fear." "I know," Ebony replied quietly. She glanced at, who was playing with building blocks, blissfully unaware of the tension. "I want her to believe in kindness, in community. But what can we do when one person is spearheading all this, and everyone else is either complicit or too scared to stand up?" It was at that moment they decided to reach out to his cousin, the journalist. If the authorities weren't truly motivated to fix the situation, maybe public exposure could bring about change. Ebony was a bit uneasy, but insisted, "We have to protect our right to live here without being harassed, Ebony." So the journalist, a woman named Morales, came to their home on a rainy evening. She was slim with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. She set up her recorder at their kitchen table, listening intently as Ebony recounted their experiences, starting with the initial 911 call, the hateful notes, the vandalism, and the threatening presence of Mrs. Nelson took copious notes, asked clarifying questions, and showed genuine empathy. "I've reported on racial harassment cases before," she explained gently. "They don't always get the attention they deserve, but when they do, things can change. People are often shocked to learn this is happening in their own backyard." She paused, glancing at, who was giggling happily in the living room, oblivious to the gravity of the conversation. "You're very brave to speak out. We'll be careful in how we handle the story so you're not put in more danger." And Ebony saw hope in his eyes. They believed she had the passion and resources to shine a light on this injustice. After she left, Ebony exhaled a long, weary breath and buried her face in his shoulder. "I hope we're doing the right thing," she whispered. He kissed her forehead gently, trying to convey reassurance. "We have to try." In the subsequent days, reached out to other neighbors for interviews. Some refused to speak. A few gave her quotes about how Mrs. Nelson didn't mean any harm or how the family was bringing trouble. But a handful expressed disgust with the blatant harassment. Those comments, compiled alongside footage from the White security cameras, painted a stark picture. The draft article showed, and Ebony was titled, "When Hate Moves Next Door." A family under siege in suburbia. Though the piece was poignant, Ebony worried that publishing it would provoke Mrs. Nelson or others to even more drastic actions. Submitted the article to her editor, who decided to run it in an upcoming issue of the local paper and also on their online platform. In the meantime, the Whites tried to brace themselves. They had no idea how the neighborhood or Mrs. Nelson would react once the story went public. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon in a blaze of red and gold, was outside adjusting one of the security cameras. He heard a distinct rattle near the fence. He tensed, scanning the perimeter. Before he could react, someone was on him, shoving him hard against the side of the house. The impact jarred his bones, and he gasped in pain. He felt a hand clamp around his mouth. "Stop messing with Mrs. Nelson," hissed a voice behind him. "Stop bringing your trouble here. You don't belong." A mixture of rage and terror fueled. He lashed out with his elbow, connecting with the attacker's ribs. The man staggered back, giving room to twist and face him. He was a stocky figure in dark clothing, a hood covering most of his face. Could smell stale alcohol on his breath. Before could fully orient himself, the man lunged again, swinging wildly. Managed to dodge, but not fast enough. A blow grazed his jaw, sending pain shooting through his face. Ebony's voice rang out from inside the house. She must have heard the commotion, used the distraction to land a punch on the man's shoulder, forcing him to stumble. Then the assailant spun around and darted off into the darkness, jumping over a low fence and disappearing into the shadows. Ebony rushed out, frantic. "Oh my God, are you okay?" She touched his bleeding lip, her eyes clouded with worry and fury. His heart pounded like a drum. "I'll be okay," he said, wincing. "Call the police. I think I got him on camera." Ebony ran inside, returning moments later with her phone in hand. They filed yet another police report, showing the new footage. This time, the camera caught a partial view of the man's face as he leapt the fence, though the angle was still oblique. It was better evidence than they'd ever had before. The officer who arrived seemed more concerned than previous responders had been. He promised to include the footage in the report and said they'd keep an eye out. His heart still hammered, disbelief flooding him. He had just been physically assaulted in his own yard. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood. Some neighbors offered lukewarm sympathy, while others whispered that maybe had started the fight or staged it. The schism was now glaringly wide. A handful of neighbors, those Ebony had grown close to through the dance studio, around the Whites. One of them even volunteered to set up a neighborhood watch group that included Ebony and. But the group's formation was met with sneers from Mrs. Nelson and her entourage. They viewed it as a sign that the Whites were causing a stir, dividing the neighborhood. The local paper released its article soon after. It spread on social media, collecting a flurry of comments, some supportive, some vile. The story detailed a pattern of harassment, featuring quotes from Ebony and in referencing the ambiguous role the police had played. Mrs. Nelson was not named explicitly, but had described an elderly neighbor with a history of disruptive 911 calls. Anyone from Sylvan Street recognized who it was. The public reaction poured fuel on an already simmering fire. Mrs. Nelson, incensed at being indirectly outed in such a public way, stepped up her campaign of intimidation. One day, Ebony found dead flowers strewn across their porch, arranged in a twisted mockery of a wreath. Another time, their garbage cans were flipped and the contents strewn across the street. Whether Mrs. Nelson was doing it herself or enlisting others, they weren't sure, but it was escalating dangerously. Despite the tension, Ebony tried to maintain a sense of normalcy for. She took her to the park, went on walks, tried to keep her bedtime routine of stories and cuddles. She refused to let her child's life be defined by fear, yet the anxiety never fully vanished. In the back of her mind, Ebony feared another confrontation, another push, another violent outburst. Her fear was justified late one night when they were jolted from sleep by the piercing sound of glass shattering. Jumped out of bed and raced downstairs, Ebony close behind him. A brick had been hurled through the living room window. Frigid air poured in through the gaping hole, along with flecks of glass. Stood at the top of the stairs, tears in her eyes, hugging a stuffed rabbit. "Mommy, Daddy," she whimpered. Ebony rushed to comfort her, darted outside, anger and adrenaline surging. In the faint glow of he caught a glimpse of someone running up Mrs. Nelson's driveway. He couldn't be certain it was the same hooded figure as before, but something in the shape and movement triggered his memory. By the time he got closer, the figure had vanished behind the house. Confronted Mrs. Nelson's front door, his blood roaring in his ears. He could see a light inside. Without thinking, he banged on the door. The porch light flicked on. A moment later, Mrs. Nelson opened the door a few inches. She didn't look alarmed. She looked triumphant, a smirk tugging at her wrinkled features. "Why are you banging on my door at this hour?" she demanded, her voice cold. His breathing was ragged, fury trembling in every muscle. "Someone threw a brick through our window, and I saw them run here." He glared at her, heart pounding. "I'm done with this, Mrs. Nelson. If you had anything to do with it, we will find out." She crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "How dare you accuse me?" she snapped. "Look at you, barging onto my porch in the middle of the night, causing a scene. Some of us are trying to get some sleep." Almost couldn't speak for the rage filling his throat. He knew it was pointless to argue with her, but he had to say something. "You can't keep doing this. We have cameras, we'll get the proof we need." He glanced past her shoulder, suspecting the accomplice might be lurking inside. Mrs. Nelson let out a disdainful laugh. "Cameras, proof, you think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and change the way we live here? You're mistaken." She began to close the door, but not before adding, "You do well to move out before something worse happens." stood there stunned at the blatant threat. She wasn't even hiding it anymore. In that moment, he realized they were locked in a battle that could escalate to far more dangerous territory. He walked away, feeling the sting of tears he refused to shed. Every fiber of his being wanted to confront her more forcefully, to scream in her face that she was a hateful, vile person. But he knew better. He couldn't risk an arrest or an altercation that would only feed her narrative. Inside his own home, he found Ebony cradling by the couch, the child trembling. Tiny shards of glass reflected the moonlight on the carpet. Ebony's eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they both acknowledged their worst fear. This was not simply about harassment. Their lives were in danger. The police arrived once again, taking statements, photographing the damage, and making notes. Another report, another promise to keep an eye out, more of the same. Felt hollow as he watched the cruiser roll away, feeling certain that nothing substantial would change. He climbed the stairs with Ebony, hugging until she stopped shaking. The three of them climbed into the master bed, too afraid and exhausted to sleep separately. Only then did Ebony allow the tears to flow, quiet so as not to further frighten, but full of anguish and helpless fury. By morning, news of the brick incident spread through social media. Called, wanting to do a follow-up piece. The local police also called to say they'd step up patrols on Sylvan Street. Neighbors were split. Some were horrified that things had escalated to this degree, while others muttered that the Whites were dramatizing everything or possibly orchestrating incidents for attention. Both Ebony felt battered by the constant negativity, longing for a semblance of normalcy. In a small but meaningful gesture, the sympathetic neighbors organized a unity walk along Sylvan Street, an idea proposed by a local pastor who believed that visibility and solidarity could counter the fear. On a Saturday morning, about 24 people gathered in front of the Whites' house, carrying signs that read "All are welcome" and "Stop the hate." They marched up and down the street, chanting positive messages, passing out flyers about embracing diversity and kindness. It was the first time in weeks that Ebony felt a glimmer of hope. Some older residents watched from their porches, stone-faced. Mrs. Nelson's blinds remained shut, but one could imagine her venomous glare from behind them. Yet the walk was more than a mere symbolic gesture. It showed that not everyone was under Mrs. Nelson's sway, that not everyone accepted her hostility. It affirmed, too, and Ebony, that they weren't alone. Tears of relief slid down Ebony's cheeks as she marched with small hand clasped in her own. Even, usually stoic in the face of adversity, looked overcome with gratitude. That evening, the group of neighbors who had organized the walk came together at the Whites' house for a potluck, using it as an impromptu meeting to discuss what else could be done. Ideas ranged from petitioning the city for stronger hate crime enforcement to persuading the local council to censure Mrs. Nelson for harassment. Someone suggested taking legal action again, but Ebony had already tried that avenue. Others wanted to push for a local hearing, a community meeting, but so far, the city hadn't responded enthusiastically. During the meeting, Ebony noticed in the corner the neighbor who had once seemed ambivalent. He looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot as if he was rethinking his stance. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Look," he said hesitantly, "I was never against you guys. I was just, I don't know, I listened to Mrs. Nelson because she's lived here forever, but this has gone way too far." He stared at the floor, a flush creeping up his neck. "I'm sorry, I want to help." Squeezed a shoulder gratefully. "Thank you," he said, a lump in his throat. He could sense that shift might represent a larger change in the neighborhood's attitude. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. But in every war, there's always a last stand, a final confrontation where the stakes rise to unimaginable heights. That confrontation came without warning on a night when the air was thick and restless, clouds brooding overhead as thunder murmured in the distance. The house was quiet, was asleep. Ebony was grading dance assignments and was wrapping up work emails. A furious knocking rattled the front door. Ebony exchanged startled looks. It was nearly midnight. Cautiously, got up and opened the door a crack. Standing there, drenched in sweat and fear, was a teenage boy, maybe 15 or 16. Recognized him, he was one of the kids who sometimes ran around with the group that teased. The boy's eyes were wide, terror etched into every angle of his young face. "Help," he panted, tears streaming down his cheeks. "It's my sister, she's hurt. Please, you gotta help me." Blinked, mind reeling, uncertain whether this was a trick, but Ebony rushed forward, maternal instincts engaged, seeing the genuine panic in the boy's eyes. What happened? She asked urgently. She was hanging out near Mrs. Nelson's backyard fence, and some older guy came out yelling at her, the boy said in a trembling voice. He pushed her, she fell. She's bleeding. So heart hammered. Let's go, he said, grabbing his phone to call 911 as he stepped outside. Ebony hesitated, torn between staying with and helping, but the frightened teen's pleas tugged at her, so she told she'd follow. She quickly ran upstairs to ensure was safe in bed, then jogged out to find and the boy. The darkness was near absolute, the street eerily deserted. Behind Mrs. Nelson's house, they found a small group of teenagers crouched around a girl who lay on the ground, whimpering. Shone his phone's flashlight on her. She had a gash on her forehead, blood trickling down her cheek. Call an ambulance, Ebony told. He was already on the line with emergency services, describing the situation. The teens muttered frantically that they had been there just messing around, goofing off, and that an older man had emerged from Mrs. Nelson's property, screaming slurs. One teen claimed the man had been drinking, his words slurred, his anger explosive. After the girl fell and started bleeding, he apparently ran off toward the back fence. Even as they administered first aid to the wounded teen, using Ebony's scarf to apply pressure to the cut, Mrs. Nelson appeared, looming in the shadows. She was wearing a nightgown, slippers, and a furious scowl. "What are you doing in my yard?" She snapped, her voice shrill. "Get out, this is private property." Turned to face her, anger rising in his chest. "Someone just got hurt here, possibly by someone you know. We already called for an ambulance." Mrs. Nelson sneered. "I don't know what you're talking about. You have no right to be here. Get off my property now, or I'll call the police." She pointed a trembling finger at Ebony, then at the teenagers. The wounded girl let out a low moan, her eyes fluttering. Sirens sounded in the distance, growing closer. Ebony tried to remain calm, but she felt fury at Mrs. Nelson's complete lack of concern for this child's safety. "A young girl is hurt," Ebony said firmly. "Why don't you care about that?" "I care about trespassers on my land," Mrs. Nelson hissed, stepping closer. "All of you people are causing trouble. I've had enough." The venom in her voice sent chills down Ebony's spine, stepped protectively in front of Ebony and the teens. "You can't keep doing this," he growled. "This has gone too far." "Are you threatening me, boy, Mrs.?" Nelson shot back, a hateful glint in her eyes. Then, almost spitting the words, she added, "There was no trouble here until people like you arrived." Blue and red lights reflected off the back fence as an ambulance pulled up, followed by a police cruiser. Paramedics rushed in, quickly assessing the injured girl, placing her on a stretcher. The teens looked rattled, some on the verge of tears. The police officer, a different one from the previous incidents, demanded an explanation. Explained everything, his words tumbling out in a rush, how the teenage boy had knocked on their door for help, how they found this girl hurt. The teens corroborated his story, mentioning the belligerent older man who had come from Mrs. Nelson's direction. Mrs. Nelson tried to interject, insisting that she'd been asleep, that she didn't know who had come through her property. She dismissed the teens' claims as lies. But the policeman seemed far more skeptical of her than previous ones had been. Perhaps it was the entire atmosphere, the presence of injured minors, or the pattern of complaints against her. Whatever the reason, he asked her pointed questions she struggled to answer. In the ensuing chaos, Ebony consoled the teen boy who had knocked on their door. He kept repeating, "Thank you, thank you." Ebony realized that underneath the bravado of teenage delinquency, he was just a scared kid. Her heart ached, knowing how easy it was for hatred to poison young minds. She could only hope this trauma would open his eyes to the harm in Mrs. Nelson's brand of toxic xenophobia. The police eventually searched the area, though the hooded man was nowhere in sight. Felt a heavy exhaustion settle into his bones. Tonight had been terrifying, but it had also revealed the depth of Mrs. Nelson's complicity, or at least her twisted worldview. She cared more about fending off intruders than the safety of a bleeding child. In the days that followed, the teenage girl recovered from her injuries. She and the other teens provided statements to the police. Though their accounts had some inconsistencies, mostly out of fear or confusion, they all agreed an older man affiliated with Mrs. Nelson had caused the incident. The police began to take the matter more seriously, considering charges of aggravated assault. Mrs. Nelson was questioned multiple times, though she vehemently any knowledge of the man's identity. Meanwhile, Morales wrote a scathing follow-up piece, interviewing the injured girl's family. The story spread beyond the local paper into the regional news. Online, readers expressed outrage at the continued harassment on Sylvan Street. Pressure mounted on local law enforcement, and soon city officials were forced to address the matter. They organized a town hall meeting to discuss racial harassment, and Ebony hesitated to attend at first. They were drained, worn out by the relentless attacks, but ultimately they decided they had to speak up for the neighborhood's future. The meeting was held in the high school auditorium. The seats were packed, an anxious buzz filling the space. On stage, the mayor, the police chief, and other local officials sat in a row, each gripping a microphone. The tension was palpable. Some people in the audience scowled at the whites, while others gave them encouraging nods. Mrs. Nelson sat in the front row, her posture rigid, arms crossed tightly over her chest. After a few introductory remarks about concerns for community harmony and commitment to safety, the floor was opened for public comment. Dozens lined up behind the microphone stand. One by one, people told their stories. A black woman recounted the suspicious stares she received while jogging in the neighborhood. A Latinx father described how the police were called on him while he was playing ball with his kids at the park. A biracial teenager talked about feeling unwelcome in school clubs because of coded language from certain families. Then, Ebony stepped up to the microphone, by her side, clutching her hand. She spoke through trembling lips, pouring her heart out. She described the 911 call that greeted them soon after they moved in, the vandalism, the threats, the assault, and the relentless anxiety that had replaced the comfort of their own home. Her voice cracked when she mentioned how a little girl had to endure seeing her parents rattled by bigotry. The audience fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on them. When Ebony finished, took the microphone. His voice, though quieter, reverberated with raw emotion. He explained that they weren't there to demonize the entire neighborhood, but to highlight that hate, even if it comes from one or two individuals, can infect an entire community if left unchecked. He pleaded for real accountability, real consequences. He turned to the mayor, to the police chief, and asked, "At what point do families like ours get the protection we deserve? At what point do we matter enough to stop ignoring this problem?" A ripple of applause broke out in the audience, mingled with hushed murmurs. Mrs. Nelson's lips pressed into a thin line. She looked ready to explode. When her turn came, she strode up to the microphone with her spine stiff and her gaze locked on Ebony and, "I have lived here for 3 decades, she began, voice trembling with fury. "I know what's best for Sylvan Street. These folks come in bringing all sorts of trouble and then blame me for it." She glanced around, trying to rally others to her side. "I'm an old woman. I just want peace and quiet. Is that a crime?" She lifted her chin defiantly. "They've attacked my reputation. They've smeared my name in the press, all because they can't follow the rules of a polite neighborhood." An uneasy shuffle moved through the auditorium. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while a few nodded in support of her. But Mrs. Nelson was not done. "That child who got hurt. It's awful, but it wasn't anyone associated with me, I can tell you that. I've tried to protect this community, but these troublemakers keep twisting the truth." She directed a withering glare at Ebony, and, "If they want to live here, they need to abide by our standards. No loud music, no shady visitors, no filthy yard. Is that too much to ask?" Ebony's anger boiled over. She had to bite her tongue to keep from shouting. The mayor quickly intervened, politely asking Mrs. Nelson to wrap up her remarks. Seethed as Mrs. Nelson stepped down, her face mottled with triumph. The tension was electric. It was clear that the meeting was a catalyst. No one could claim ignorance anymore. The entire community had heard both sides laid bare. In the aftermath, local social media lit up with debates. Some hailed the whites as courageous. Others claimed they were stirring up trouble. But a majority sentiment began to take shape, an understanding that Mrs. Nelson had escalated far beyond any semblance of reason. Investigations into the assaults and vandalism continued, and rumors spread that the police identified the hooded man as a distant nephew of Mrs. Nelson, who had a history of drunk and disorderly conduct. He had apparently fled town after the brick incident, fearing arrest. Eventually, charges were brought against Mrs. Nelson for harassment and providing misleading statements to the police. The case garnered enough public attention that the district attorney felt compelled to act. Though the wheels of justice turned slowly, it was a significant step, a sign that hateful behavior would no longer be tacitly condoned. The day Mrs. Nelson was taken to the station for questioning felt surreal to and Ebony. She was not arrested on the spot, but the formal charges made her appear less invincible. During this waiting period, the Whites found an unexpected wave of community support. Neighbors banded together to help repair the damage to their property. A group of local residents around Ebony's dance studio, signing their kids up for her classes in a show of solidarity. One older man, who had been silent throughout most of the conflict, quietly placed a handwritten note in their mailbox that read, "I'm sorry we didn't do more sooner. Thank you for standing up for what's right." Tears welled up in Ebony's eyes as she read that note. Maybe hearts could change, even if it came slower than they wanted. On a sunny afternoon, took to the local park, and for the first time, he didn't feel the weight of 100 suspicious eyes on him. Instead, other families greeted him kindly, some even apologizing if they had believed any of Mrs. Nelson's rumors. It felt like a small renaissance of empathy blossoming in the once hostile environment. As winter approached, the court date for Mrs. Nelson's hearing was set. She faced multiple charges related to harassment, filing false police reports, and allegedly conspiring with her nephew in the assault. The entire neighborhood buzzed with talk of the upcoming trial, and Ebony were called to testify about the repeated 911 calls, the property damage, the intimidation. It was nerve-wracking, but they steeled themselves. If they wanted real closure, they had to see this through. On the day of the hearing, Ebony dressed in a conservative blouse in a neat suit. They held hands outside the courthouse, the chilly wind biting at their cheeks. Morales was there, ready to report on the outcome. A small group of supporters offered reassuring smiles. Mrs. Nelson arrived with a grim expression, her lawyer by her side. She cut a pitiful figure, no longer the unassailable matriarch, but an old woman trembling under the weight of potential consequences. Inside the courtroom, testimonies stacked up against her. The teens who had seen the hooded nephew spoke, describing his connection to Mrs. Nelson. The police presented footage of repeated 911 calls that were groundless. And Ebony recounted their harrowing experiences, from the day the cops first showed up on their lawn to the time a brick shattered their window. Though the defense tried to cast doubt, the evidence was overwhelming. In the end, the judge found Mrs. Nelson guilty on several counts of harassment and providing false statements to law enforcement. She was sentenced to probation, fines, and mandatory counseling. For an elderly woman who had thrived on a sense of power and control, it was a humiliating downfall. She left the courthouse with hunched shoulders, escorted by her attorney, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. The day the verdict was announced, and Ebony shared a long, tearful hug. It wasn't perfect justice. The nephew remained at large, and they could never fully erase the fear and trauma of the past months. But it was a statement, a public reckoning that hate would not go unchallenged. The entire neighborhood now had to grapple with the truth that one of their own, a longtime resident, had terrorized a young family simply because they looked different. Back on Sylvan Street, life took on a different hue. The house with the pale green shutters stood as a testament to resilience. Slowly, the Whites rebuilt their sense of home. A kind neighbor painted a mural of unity on the side of their garage, depicting people of all backgrounds holding hands in a circle. Now a bit older, pranced around the yard without the shadow of fear, squealing at the sight of squirrels and the rustle of the new fallen leaves. Some neighbors who had originally stood with Mrs. Nelson tried to apologize. Others quietly slunk back into their houses, still resentful but too wary to act. Several for sale signs popped up on the street, possibly because the neighborhood drama had tarnished the area's reputation. Yet new families moved in as well, more diverse than ever, drawn by the news coverage that had inadvertently spotlighted Sylvan Street. Over time, the sense of community slowly healed, forging a cautious unity from the ashes of conflict. One afternoon, Ebony watched from the porch as, and a few other kids from the street, played hopscotch together on the sidewalk. The sound of their laughter was a balm to every injury their family had sustained. The porch swing gently rocked under her weight and sat beside her, sipping iced tea despite the cool autumn air. They were both watchful, scars still fresh, but they felt hope beginning to unfurl inside them. "Remember when we first moved here?" asked softly, gazing at his daughter's bright grin. "We had no idea what was coming." Ebony nodded, interlacing her fingers with his. "Sometimes I still can't believe we lived through all of that. But look at us now. followed her gaze. "Yeah," he said, an unmistakable warmth in his voice. "We're still here." They sat together on that porch, thinking of everything they had faced: terror, discrimination, a relentless campaign of hate. And yet here was, playing happily on the street they now called home. Against all odds, they had prevailed. Their story had exposed not just the ugliness of bigotry, but also the potential for a community to come together in solidarity. People often asked Ebony if she ever regretted moving to Sylvan Street. She would pause, remembering the heartbreak, the nights spent in tears, the moment her husband was assaulted, the fear in her daughter's eyes. But then she would recall how neighbors eventually behind them, how the courts held Mrs. Nelson accountable, how that unity march transformed suspicion into empathy. So Ebony's answer would always be measured, filled with caution but also conviction. "We faced evil here," she'd say, "but we also found love and courage. That's what we're choosing to focus on." Life never returned to a perfect calm. There were still moments when Ebony and felt a twinge of anxiety at a sudden noise outside, or side-eyed an unfamiliar vehicle parked too long near their house. Trauma left its echoes. But they also found purpose in sharing their experience, advocating for stronger hate crime legislation, and supporting others facing similar struggles. Articles had sparked larger conversations in the city about racial bias and the need for systemic change, a conversation that was ongoing but vital. Months later, Mrs. Nelson's house went up for sale. Rumor had it she was moving out of state to live with a distant relative. The sign on her lawn felt like a final punctuation mark to a dark chapter. Some said it was about time, others mused that it was the right choice for everyone involved. When the moving truck arrived, Ebony watched from her porch as Mrs. Nelson's belongings were carried out. The old woman stepped outside one last time, glancing around the street she had presided over for so long. Her eyes fell on Ebony, and for a moment they locked gazes. Ebony half expected another hateful glare, another sneer of contempt, but Mrs. Nelson simply averted her eyes and vanished inside the truck, leaving Sylvan Street behind. In the hush that followed, Ebony felt a strange mix of relief and pity. Despite all the pain Mrs. Nelson had caused, a small part of Ebony wondered if the woman could have changed had she chosen compassion over hate. Then ran up the porch steps, beaming with the unburdened joy of a child who knew she was safe, appeared behind her carrying groceries. Ebony closed her eyes, inhaling the fresh air. The old neighbor was gone, a new day was here. In time, people would forget the name Mrs. Nelson and the specifics of what transpired on Sylvan Street, but the lessons would endure. The Whites' quiet determination to stand their ground reminded everyone that racism doesn't just reside in dramatic headlines. It lives in subtle glances, whispered rumors, and the unchallenged beliefs of those who fear change, and it can only be defeated by shining a bright, unwavering light upon it. As the last of the moving truck disappeared down the road, Ebony and turned their attention back to their daughter, to their life, and to the promise of future peace in a neighborhood that, despite everything, was finally starting to feel like home. And as the seasons changed once more, the pastel paint of their house seemed brighter, the yard felt more welcoming, and the laughter of family and friends filled the space where silence once choked out hope. Indeed, what happened next was unbelievable, but it also to the power of human resilience and the undeniable truth that love and unity can, even if slowly, triumph over hate.